Psychological research confirms that from birth, human beings have an intense need to belong, to connect with others in enduring close relationships. Clearly, children's attachment to their caregivers promotes their survival and well-being. When adults are asked what is necessary for their happiness, the most common answer is satisfying close relationships with family, friends, and romantic partners. People spend much time thinking about actual and hoped-for relationships. When people are ignored, excluded, or rejected, negative emotions can be overwhelming. Dr. Kip Williams and his colleagues at the University of New South Wales have been studying the phenomenon of ostracism. It affects both those who use and receive this interpersonal strategy.
Ostracism is the act of excluding and ignoring an individual or a group by an individual or a group. And it has a lot of names. Sometimes it's called shunning, exile, banishment. Those would be cases where you're physically removed from other people. But sometimes you're in the presence of other people, in which case you might call it the silent treatment, getting the cold shoulder. In England and in Australia they call it being sent to Coventry. The Amish community call it Maidung, where they ostracize somebody from within their group when they violated some norm.
Ostracism threatens 4 fundamental human needs. The need to belong. Human beings need to feel connected to others. Obviously, ostracism undermines this feeling of belonging. Sense of control. People need to feel in control of their lives. Even in conflict, people can exercise some control as long as they can argue their point of view. When ostracized, they lose that sense of control. Self-esteem. Human beings need to value and respect themselves. Ostracism produces a feeling that an individual has done something wrong, or that there is something about a person that is different or bad. Sense of meaningful existence. People need to feel that their existence has purpose. Ostracism takes away that sense of purpose and gives a person a look at what life would be like if they didn't exist.
Ostracism is a metaphor for death. This is what life would be like if you didn't exist. And so you feel yourself as though you're invisible and not there and totally meaningless. I was at a park one day with my dog, and I was just minding my own business, and suddenly a frisbee knocked against my back, and I looked up and I saw 2 guys that were playing with the frisbee, and I tossed it back to them. And to my surprise, they tossed it back to me, and I felt kind of good for a moment and thought, well, this is fun, and I got up and went and joined them, and we were tossing the frisbee amongst ourselves for about 3 or 4 tosses, and then suddenly they stopped tossing it to me. And I'm standing there, and they're tossing it to each other, and they're having fun, and I'm feeling particularly awkward and strange and not knowing what to do, and I felt bad, and finally I sort of backtracked to my dog and licked my wounds. But I thought to myself, gee, that's a really powerful and effective way to produce this feeling of ostracism that I could possibly do in the laboratory.
In Williams' experiment, 1 subject and 2 Confederates are instructed to wait quietly in a small room for the experimenter to return.
People, it was like for learning experiment or like teaching how people learn or something like that. But it was so bizarre because the people weren't actually shocking anybody. Like the people, they were like behind some kind of glass thing, and they were just acting like they were being shocked, but they weren't being shocked. But the people...
One of the Confederates discovers a ball and begins tossing it.
Wow, it was bizarre. It was like, and they would keep on increasing the strength of the shock, and it was like, they increased the strength of the shock, and they thought they were hurting this person, but they weren't.
Eventually, the Confederates stopped throwing to the subject. In this reenactment, the subject clearly shows signs of stress as the ball tossing goes on without her.
And I don't know, I thought it was really weird. It was bizarre, I can't imagine. Can you imagine shocking someone? yeah, it was weird. I thought it was funny.
So I guess we're supposed to talk about these questions. So this first one's about divorce and why we think the divorce rate's so high.
In a similar experiment, two Confederates and one subject seemingly comprise a discussion group. The reaction of the subject is easily observable as she discovers she's being left out of the conversation.
React. First, to the point about how it feels, it's worth paying attention to the fact that when we describe how it feels to feel left out, we use a lot of the same words that we would otherwise use to describe what being physically in pain is like. For example, we might say that people hurt our feelings, that a person broke our heart in a relationship. These are pretty vivid pieces of language, but it might go beyond just a metaphor between being physically hurt and feeling socially hurt. Research using brain imaging is able to look at what people's brains are doing when they're experiencing rejection. What they'll do is they'll have people in an fMRI scanner and they'll make them feel like they're playing a game with some other people, and as the game goes along, the other people start to ignore them. Now, this is just a big ruse, and in fact, there are no other people, but the people in the scanner are feeling it pretty intensely. And so how does that feeling of being left out look? Well, what's interesting is that the same part of the brain that's often involved in feeling physical pain is also involved in this emotional experience as well. The dorsal anterior cingulate. It's the same part of the brain that actually is involved when you feel physical pain, and it comes online when you feel rejected as well. Another way to test this relationship between physical pain and social rejection is to give people Tylenol. That sounds crazy, of course, but it actually works. If you give people Tylenol over a course of 3 weeks, what some researchers found is that compared to groups that had been taking a placebo for 3 weeks, the people who had been taking Tylenol ended up feeling less social pain as the days went on. In other words, taking a pill that we know is involved in making your physical pain go down also makes your feeling of social rejection go down.
In a third experiment, Williams and his colleagues extended the ball-tossing paradigm to cyberspace. In this environment, the subject tosses a virtual ball to two other people located elsewhere on the Internet. When an individual stops receiving the ball, he or she begins to feel excluded and isolated, exactly as one would in a face-to-face situation. Cardiovascular measurements taken during this cyber ostracism experiment show that the subject experiences physiological arousal and stress response. These short-term effects are similar to those of people who have been ostracized over a long period of time and have major implications for both psychological and physical health.
There's several ways to respond in the middle stage to try to regain a sense of belonging and control and self-esteem, and some of them may be more functional than others. Sometimes you try to reestablish your sense of belonging by maybe conforming to the group a little bit more, or being more pleasant to be around so that you're not going to be ostracized. But other times people respond to ostracism with frustration because they're not getting any response, and so they try to provoke a response, and they might say something or get in somebody's face, or if they still don't get a response, they might say very nasty things or maybe even shove them. And we have one case where the wife eventually, because she wasn't getting a response from the husband, picked up a marble ashtray and threw it at her husband's head. There are many times in our interviews with people who have had exposures to long-term ostracism where they initially reacted with aggression and violence. And so one way to reestablish a sense of control is to provoke and become violent so that you do control something.
Extreme reactions to ostracism may bring about tragedy in its most horrific form. In 1999, at Columbine High School in Colorado, 2 disgruntled students who felt extreme rejection killed 12 classmates, 1 teacher, and wounded 23 others before killing themselves.